I would like to start by thanking UNDP and the National Economics University for organizing this event despite these challenging times. While it's hard to look beyond the immediate difficulties that Vietnam is facing due to the current outbreak of the coronavirus, it is important not to forget that advancing responsible business will have positive effects for the country long term. That is why it's so crucial. Knowledge and practice of responsible business can both help Vietnam mitigate the effects of the current crisis and make it more resilient in the future. No one can escape a pandemic, but with the right tools, unemployment and loss of income can be minimized, and decent work conditions and workplace safety can be maintained or even accelerated. I know we had hoped for a hybrid event enabling in-person meetings and in-break conversations. Even so, I'm pleased to see such a strong participation online. Your presence contributes to rich content and to a successful outcome of this seminar. Today is the third time I participate at an event under the UNDP-led program Responsible Business Practice Vietnam. It is part of UNDP's regional program Business and Human Rights Asia. Responsible and sustainable business is an essential component in ensuring sustainable development. That is why Sweden is a proud and long-standing supporter of this program. For the last 2 years, UNDP Vietnam, together with the Vietnamese government, international partners and the business sector, have examined, mapped, and presented the legal framework and the corporate awareness of responsible business practices in Vietnam. Sorry, I have something here. All of this constitutes essential preparatory work to create good conditions for developing a national action plan on advancing responsible business practices in Vietnam next year, an overall goal of this program. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. When adopted, the guiding principles represented a groundbreaking first step for all relevant actors, states, businesses, investors, and other stakeholders. Nowadays, many view them as global standard in this area. To date, almost 30 countries have adopted national action plans on business and human rights. My country, Sweden, was the 6th country to do so in 2015. In the process of developing and eventually adopting the Swedish National Action Plan, a broad range of stakeholders were consulted. The draft was both published for public comments online and subject to 4 public consultation meetings. With explicit intention, broad commitment was sought, both to make the plan more all-encompassing, but also to improve the chances of a successful implementation with high compliance and respect for regulations. By making it a joint effort and responsibility, all stakeholders work together to achieve the desired outcomes. We have also seen the important role of multinational companies in promoting responsible business practice in their supply chains and how they can influence to improve standards. IKEA, Atlas Copco, and H&M are a few Swedish companies that makes such an example, also active here in Vietnam. I have visited many workplaces and factories in Vietnam during my 2 years here, and I have witnessed myself how workplaces with functioning dialogue between management and workers lead to better working conditions. It might be about the safety procedures in dangerous environments and factories, or how to organize work in times of the pandemic. It might be about acting on harassment in the workplace, or improved conditions for working parents to find a work-life balance. But responsible business is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. In Sweden, we are convinced that successful and competitive business of the future are those who make human rights and corporate social responsibility part of their core business. Companies that step away from doing business in a sustainable and responsible manner will eventually face challenges in retaining both employees and customers. Today's customers are becoming more and more aware of their own power and possibility to influence the world in a more fair and sustainable direction by making well-informed choices. And so, by setting our standards high, we create the best condition for our businesses to become world leaders. We are also setting our standards high when it comes to the workplace. Decent work and quality jobs require good working conditions. Good working conditions are also necessary to enable innovation and leads to higher workplace efficiency. Sweden has strong unions and strong businesses. Together, they form partners in a social dialogue that has been the key factor, I would say, for Sweden's progress. Social dialogue is indeed a win-win opportunity. Workers win by gaining influence and better working conditions. Companies win from a constructive working atmosphere and increased productivity. Society wins from inclusive growth and social stability. Sweden has a long tradition of supporting Vietnam in the field of labor rights. The latest example is a startup of the Swedish workplace program, SWP, in Vietnam in 2020. The SWP is built on a partnership between the International Council of Swedish Industry and the Metal and Industrial Workers Union in Sweden, IF Metall. It has now projects in 11 countries. One of the main objectives of the SWP in Vietnam is to support companies to strengthen their relationship between management and employees through workplace dialogue, where employees are listened to and encouraged to make their voices heard. Sweden believes that every workplace is a high potential platform to address challenges, to identify and mitigate risks, and to improve the sustainability of business operations. Building awareness and knowledge and capacity to advance responsible business long-term require a broad approach. Using education as a tool to accelerate progress constitutes, if rightly managed, an important aspect of such an approach. Hence, the main purpose of today is just that, to share expertise and experiences on how to advance responsible business knowledge in the education sector. Yesterday focused on responsible leadership. For those of you who attended, you heard representatives from the National Economic University and Molisa talk about the necessity of good management. You also heard business representatives share their insights on how responsible business models can facilitate crisis management. Running your business responsibly is just as important during normal time as during a pandemic, but it may require more effort during the latter. Today's focus will be on how to practically integrate responsible business into business and economic school curricula in Vietnam. We will hear professors and doctors from 4 different universities and countries share their expertise in this area. Today is indeed an opportunity to shed light on how education in responsible business practice will help Vietnam to achieve not only progress in terms of economic growth and stronger competitiveness for its companies, but also in reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. Social dialogue is the foundation for building a strong and resilient workforce, and through that, positive change. By making responsible business practices part of the curricula in business school, Vietnam's future business leaders will acquire skills that will be in high demand both by international and domestic companies in the future. Furthermore, it will attract foreign investors and companies to conduct business in Vietnam. In addition, by integrating responsible business thinking as part of the education system, Vietnam shows its seriousness in implementing the UN guiding principles and its genuine dedication to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Indeed, Vietnam has in recent years shown its determination to follow this direction by ratifying nearly all of the ILO core conventions and by adopting a new, more progressive labor code. These advancements was also made part of the negotiations ahead of the EVFTA, the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. Sweden and the EU will follow closely also the implementation of these conventions and laws, since they constitute an important building block in our partnership. I'm convinced that today's presentations and discussions will be fruitful and feed into the important work that is already underway to advance responsible business here in Vietnam. I thank the presenters for their willingness to share experiences, knowledge, and ideas, and I encourage all participants to raise questions and contribute to the discussion throughout this afternoon. Let me end by saying that Sweden will continue to partner with Vietnam and share our experience in the field of responsible business, social dialogue, labor rights, and decent work. We also look forward to continuing our work with UNDP on advancing responsible business practice in Vietnam, and in the process of supporting the Vietnamese government with developing a national action plan. I wish you all a good and productive day. Thank you very much. Sim Kaman.
Thanks, Ambassador, for this wonderful opening remarks. I think it's clear responsible business is a focus on the longer term. I mean, we have the eye on like a national action plan next year. Yeah, it's not only the right thing to do, as you say, it's a smart thing to do. Thanks for sharing the examples from Sweden. The bar is set there very high, and I think they can be learned from that part. Yeah, so over to the next session, to the professors who will be sharing their experiences. So thanks, Ambassador. I now want to introduce the next speaker. I want to introduce Professor Surya Deva, who will speak about the United Nations Protect, Respect, and Remedy Framework to advance the responsible business and human rights. Dr. Surya Deva is an associate professor at the School of Law of the City University of Hong Kong and a member of the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Since 2001, he has been researching in the areas of business and human rights and corporate social responsibility, with a focus on exploring means to hold corporations accountable for human rights violations and strengthening access to remedies for the victims. Professor Surya is also a founding editor-in-chief of the Business and Human Rights Journal at the Cambridge University, and he sits in a number of editorial advisory boards of other journals on business and human rights. I think we have the right expert to speak to you. Professor Surya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you also for the invitation. It's really my great pleasure. And I would also like to greet Ambassador Anne, who made excellent remarks to set the scene for this workshop. So I have been requested to connect the Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework, and also highlight the distinctions between business and human rights and CSR. So I have a PowerPoint, and I'm going to share that with you now. So give me a second, and then I will start. I hope you can see my slides. So these are the 4 issues that I would like to cover. I will start at the outset to try to explain how business and human rights is different from responsible business conduct, which is RBC and CSR. Then I talk about the evolution of international standards, because we cannot understand UN guiding principles in vacuum. You have to understand UN guiding principles in the context of the evolution that has been taking place in the last 4 or 5 decades. What works, what does not work. And then I will talk about the 3 pillars, and finally, very quick reflections about how we teach responsible business conduct at the business schools in Vietnam. And next speaker is going to focus more on that. So business and human rights, as we call it, BHR, is a relatively new concept. I think it did not start with the UN guiding principles. It was there for the last 20, 30 years, at least in the discourse. But I would suggest that the issues that we discuss now as part of BHR are not new. We can trace it, at least, to the colonial period when these businesses were operating in Asia, including in Vietnam. And the exploitation done by those businesses who had received a charter from the government is a very good example of how businesses can impact human rights in an adverse manner. And if anyone has interest, I will strongly encourage to read this book written by a historian, where he traces the role of British East India Company in this part of the world. But at the same time, now we have certain key elements when we talk about business and human rights. And some of these elements are highlighted on this slide. From my perspective, the starting point is that we have to think of businesses not merely as profit maximizing entities. Profit is important, but I call it profit with principles. So you make profit, but you have to follow the principles, and the principles are respecting human rights at the minimum. And this responsibility is independent of the responsibility of the duties that the governments may have. And of course, we have to ensure that the businesses who do not follow these standards, they are held accountable. I think those are critical elements, in my view, of this idea of business and human rights. What is then RBC, responsible business conduct? And I think there are different ways of defining it. But for me, one crucial distinction between BHR and RBC is that the RBC is a broader or a wider concept. It focuses on issues which are not essentially part of human rights. So if you see on this slide, business and human rights is the smaller circle in my view, because here the focus is on human rights. And responsible business conduct is a wider, broader concept, which has to include business and human rights, but it may touch upon issues which may not be regarded as part of core. And I think we can refer here to issues about taxation. We can talk about anti-competitive behavior on the part of businesses. We can also think of climate change as well. Of course, there are close connections between human rights and climate change, but climate change and environmental issues also have an independent status. Now, the third concept is CSR, corporate social responsibility. Now, defining CSR is again not easy. There are so many different definitions. You see on this slide a very famous pyramid proposed by Professor Carroll. But what I see is that CSR is about that businesses having certain responsibilities towards society. Now, how do we differentiate CSR from BHR? And in my view, there are overlaps and elements of common in BHR and CSR, but I would highlight these 4 key differences. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are 4 differences which are vital in my view. When we talk about CSR, the role of the states and laws is not central. There may be laws, there may be states doing something about it, but it is not the fundamental component. But BHR, and as per the guiding principles as well, pillar 1 is about the states doing ABC. And I think that is a significant difference. Secondly, when we talk about CSR, it is business driven. Businesses decide what they want to do. If they want to open a school, that is fine. If they want to pay higher salary to certain workers, that is part of their social responsibility. If they want to do something for the sustainability, that is their choice. They can decide what they want to do, or they want to open a hospital, that is again their choice. But when we talk about BHR, businesses are not expected to be selective and discretionary like this. Rather, they should manage the adverse impact on human rights in all areas, on all issues, and around all people who may be impacted. Then I think another contrast we can draw is between rights holders and stakeholders. CSR is the idea of stakeholders, which we can also see in the BHR discourse. But I think BHR should be focusing on human rights and rights holders. And I think because of that reason, again, the rights holders have to be at the center of this discourse rather than the businesses. Even if businesses have to do due diligence, it has to put rights and rights holders at the center of it. Again, and the last point about this distinction is that the accountability or access to remedy is not really a key component or integral part of CSR in my view, but for BHR it is. And I think that is also part of pillar 3, which I will talk about very shortly. So that is about the conceptual distinctions. Now let us talk about the evolution of standards at the international level. As I was mentioning, UN guiding principles were adopted in 2011. We just completed the 10 years, the first decade. But I think we have to understand the context of the last 50 years of evolution of these standards, especially at these 3 UN agencies, United Nations, ILO, and OECD. Now, if you look at that, and that is, in fact, a slide I use in my classroom teaching course on business and human rights. So I try to show how this evolution has been taking place at these 3 institutions. And basically, they started around mid-1970s, and not everything got approved. So you see these crosses there, and you see these red boxes which got approved. So you have the Global Compact, you have the UN guiding principles. There's a question mark about the treaty process. Then you have the ILO declaration, which were adopted in 1977. It was revised, and the most recent version is 2017. Same could be said about the OECD guidelines. For the first time in 1976, NCPs were introduced to receive complaints in year 2000, and 2011, they were aligned with the UN guiding principles. So I think this landscape is quite relevant when you teach business and human rights, because UN guiding principles did not appear from nowhere. They appeared, they had a history from where they came, what worked, what did not work. And I think that context is very crucial. Of course, Professor John Ruggie played a key role in terms of building this consensus and navigating through the politics in a quite a smart manner, in my view. As a good salesperson, he really managed to bring everyone together. Even if they disagreed with the UN guiding principles, they did not openly question that in the Human Rights Council. And I think that was quite remarkable in that perspective. Now, when we talk about UN guiding principles, there are 3 pillars: protect, respect, and remedy. As you see, the language is slightly different because first one is the duty of the state. And there is a difference here because the second pillar is about not a duty, but merely a responsibility. So it's a soft responsibility. Third one is access to effective remedy, where both states and businesses, and of course, other non-state-based institutions have a role to play. Now, what is crucial is that all human rights are included and all businesses are captured. So it does not really matter whether you are a multinational company or you are a small informal tea shop, or you are a family business, or you are a partnership firm. It does not really matter. Everyone is expected to respect human rights. Now, of course, as I mentioned to you, there's this treaty process going on. We do not know where this will go. As you see from the votes here, the process has been highly divisive in terms of the developed countries and developing countries. There is some shift that has been taking place, but I will not have the time to go into it. But I think one thing which is very crucial is that the voluntary standards alone are not proving to be enough. There is plenty of evidence of that. And I think that is leading this tremendous amount of progress, at least in certain countries in Europe, whether it is France that has started this trend, or Norway, Germany, and Switzerland, or the Netherlands. These are the 5 countries that we have the laws of at this particular point of time. But even the European Union is trying to have a law later this year, at least in the draft form. And I think what is crucial is that even if these legislation are in Europe, they will have impact in Vietnam. They will have impact in Asia and other parts of the world, because these laws would apply not only to European companies, but also to other companies which may have a business footprint in Europe, or they could be part of the supply chains. Now, let me quickly move on to the 3 pillars. So pillar 1 has pillar 1 has 10 principles, and these 10 principles are directed towards state, basically the government, different government ministries and departments. What is crucial is that they are not limited to the physical territory of one state. Rather, the guiding principles are very clear that the expectations are to be set throughout the operations and jurisdiction. So let us take ambassador was talking about Swedish companies. So let us say if we have IKEA or H&M having factories in Vietnam. So the guiding principles would expect the government of Sweden to regulate those companies operating in Vietnam. Now, those companies are, of course, not within the territory of Sweden, but they are regarded within the jurisdiction of Sweden. And same applies, of course, to any company. Same will apply to Chinese company, Indian company, for that matter, right? So I think that is something which is a crucial component, that the impact that we're looking at is both inward, what is happening on your territory, and outward impact, which is happening outside the physical territory, but is still within the jurisdiction of a particular country. Then there are other principles. I will not have the time to go into each one of those, but let me pick up principle 4. I hope you can identify these two logos of Vietnamese companies. These are state-owned enterprises, whether it is Vietnam Electricity or Petro Vietnam. And under principle 4, there is an expectation that these companies should lead by example. They are slightly different from entirely private sector companies because the government is either having ownership or some kind of a control over these companies. So they are kind of a hybrid. They are somewhere in between the state and the private sector. And because of that hybrid status, they should definitely lead by example and do more in terms of respecting human rights. Then we also, of course, have other standards which are directly relevant. And I think one thing which is becoming increasingly crucial is that when the governments are outsourcing or making public services private, they have to ensure that the human rights issues are at the center of those contractual negotiations and everything. At the same time, policy incoherence is a big issue in the business and human rights field. And that is the example of policy incoherence, where we have different ministries, different departments pulling the government in different directions. Let us say there could be one ministry which is interested in attracting more and more investment to Vietnam. But the labor ministry may be interested to protect the rights of the workers. Environmental ministry may be interested to protect the environment in there, right? So how do you achieve this coherence amongst different ministries and departments? And I think that is the focus of principle 8. And I think that is also connected with somehow with principle 9. An ambassador and mentioned about the trade agreement, but the same applies to investment agreements. So investment and trade agreements, human rights issues have to be integrated. And when I say human rights, labor rights, environmental rights, and climate change issues are included as well. So that is a quick summary of pillar 1. Now let me quickly move on to pillar 2, which is principles 11 to 24. So we have 14 principles as part of pillar 2. What is crucial is that this is an independent responsibility of businesses. So the governments may not be doing their best in respecting human rights or protecting human rights, but that is not an excuse for companies. Companies on their own have to do what they're expected to do, which is basically not cause any negative impact and remediate any adverse impact, right? How do you do it? I think I'm going to skip this typology. The slides will be shared by UNDP to all the participants, so you will have those slides. But I would like to focus on these 3 elements. So these are the 3 things that are expected under the UN guiding principles. Each company should make a policy commitment. It should do human rights due diligence, and it should remediate. Now, human rights due diligence is a core component, and it is a 4-step cycle. It starts with an assessment of the adverse impacts. So let us say if a company finds that they are not paying same salary to the women workers, or there are not enough women in the positions of management in a factory or in a company, or they find that there are child workers in the supply chains, or if they find that there is environmental pollution, this could be part of the impact assessment that they have to do. Then whenever they find those adverse impacts, they have to do this integration, second stage, and try to understand how businesses can prevent and mitigate those adverse impacts. Nothing is perfect. You cannot fix everything overnight. Then you have to track it. You can set goals, short term, medium term, long term, And then you need to track the progress, what company is doing. And finally, you need to be communicating to the rights holders what you are doing. What is important is that the companies are mostly hesitant in sharing this. The last step is quite difficult in practice for companies. They either don't share the key information, either they share the information in a vague manner, or they don't share the damaging information. They only share the good parts of it, not the bad parts of it, or they fear that if they share the information, there could be litigation, right? But I think it is crucial that there is a transparency and information sharing takes place. Otherwise, the due diligence cycle is not going to work effectively. Third pillar is about access to remedy. There are 3 types of mechanisms which are contemplated by the UN guiding principles. One, of course, is the courts, like the state-led judicial system. But I think non-judicial grievance mechanism can also play a crucial role. That's where the national human rights institutions could come into picture. But we also have national contact points. And of course, there is no national contact point in Vietnam. But if we have an OECD company operating in Vietnam, then this complaint could definitely be made elsewhere where those companies are coming from. And then finally, we're talking about company-based grievance mechanisms, which are quite relevant here. Now, again, I will have to skip some of the slides, so you will have these slides. But what I want to highlight is that the rights holders are not a homogeneous group. So companies have to understand that there are women, children, persons with different sexual orientation, they're migrant workers, they're refugees, so on and so forth. And they have to really keep in mind their experiences when they're doing the impact. Otherwise, and I think you may wish to look at this gender framework, which is there. So let me finally conclude with some thoughts about the teaching. And I know Dorothy is going to go in deeper on that. But let me highlight, based on my experience in Asia, I would mention at least these 4 points to conclude my presentation. First of all, in my view, the local context is relevant. And I think that is where the researchers based in Vietnam at NEU and other universities are the key players. We can only share information, what we are doing, but do not blindly follow me, at least. I cannot speak for others, but do not blindly follow me. Local context is relevant, whether the informal sector or what particular issues are there, you know best. So you need to design a course which is not Eurocentric. You don't design a course for Swedish companies. You design a course based on the experiences of companies operating in Vietnam. Otherwise, it will not work. Second, UN guiding principles are absolutely critical, but do not think there is nothing else beyond UN guiding principles when you start teaching. So look ahead, what has been happening in different sectors, different issues, and of course, go beyond law. Business and human rights is not merely law. There are ethical standards, there are normative standards, morality standards, economics approaches are quite relevant. So I think you have to design a course which is interdisciplinary and it is broad enough rather than merely teaching you in guiding principles. The third point is connected to the first one in a way that most of the standards, in my view, are driven by the global north. And sometimes those standards may not be suitable to the ground realities on the global south. I dare to say that based on my experience of last 20 years. And that's why also try to think of bottom-up approaches in the global south. Look at the experiences in Cambodia. Look at the experiences in Malaysia and Thailand and Vietnam, what is working. Don't merely look at the global north. Look at closer to your conditions and the context. My last point is BHR is not an island. The political context, the economic context, the social context, religion and culture, everything is relevant. So you cannot think of BHR in isolation. So you have to situate this course or anything else in the overarching context within which you are doing that. So with this, I will conclude my remarks. Thank you once again for the opportunity. And I look forward to listening to other panelists and taking any questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, so Professor Deva, fantastic. It's always good to listen to a professor. I learned a lot today, and also some very encouraging words, I think. And that business and human rights is very current, it's very active now, but it's not new. No? I mean, companies should behave like human beings should behave, so that's good. And profit-based principles and keep companies accountable. Also, what I picked up, voluntary is not enough. And so we cannot ask anybody to voluntarily do it, but so some legislation will have impact, and maybe also in Vietnam. Yeah, fantastic presentation, and I think at the end a very good bridge to the next presenter. You say like keep it local, go beyond the UN guiding principles, look at the wider picture, and you said as well see what is working in the global south. And then one little remark there: this is part of a regional project. So you mentioned look at the experiences from Cambodia, Thailand, Bangladesh, and all the other countries. The UNDP is doing the project there as well with the support of Sweden and with the EU. So we definitely can bring these experiences from the global south to this initiative. So thanks so much. And we go to the next speaker. And I want to introduce, I'm happy to introduce the lead author of the toolkit for the case of responsible business and human rights in education, Professor Dorothy Bouwman at the Geneva University School of Economics and Management. And she will share with us how the toolkit helps. I think she put it already a lot of links in the chat box, so people are checking out the toolkit, I assume. And the toolkit is for business schools in preparing the future business professionals and leaders towards a shift towards social economy, where responsible business with human rights is an imperative. Professor Dorothy directs the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, the first human rights center at the business school in Europe. Since 2013, she's also a research director at the New York University Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. In these roles, Professor Dorothy works with companies to advance human rights in corporate practice. Her applied research is focused on embedding human rights in organizations and developing business models that enable profits and human rights principles to coexist. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Mr. Haberman, and thanks to the UNDP team for inviting me to contribute to this fantastic event. Also, thanks to everyone in the audience. It's an incredibly large audience. Thanks for your interest. I look forward to discussing the role of human rights in business education with you. It's a topic that's dear to my heart for several reasons. I will get to the more objective reasons in a moment, but I also want to share a personal one. I just got tenured at the Geneva School for Economics and Management at Geneva University. It wasn't always my plan to become a professor, but now that I have a long-term perspective in academia, I also want to make sure that my institution is successful long-term. And for this, I'm convinced that we need to reform business school education. Why? In short, to ensure that the education at business schools remains relevant. And it will only remain relevant if business schools are ready to prepare future leaders to address the very real and pressing human rights challenges and business challenges of the 21st century. The consequences of climate change, the implications of global inequalities will affect businesses, and understanding how to manage the implications will decide over which businesses are successful long-term. Business schools are in the prime position to teach the skills necessary for making business future-proof. To advance this argument will be easy because I've had two previous speakers that had done excellent scene setting. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Syria. So I will start us off with some remarks, but please feel free to put questions in the chat box while you're listening. I'll be brief to maximize the time for exchange. I'm very keen to hear from you because in all business school networks that I participate in, including the ones that I co-founded, Asian schools are vastly underrepresented, and this needs to change. So this is also an invitation to engage in today's event, but also beyond today, through networks with like-minded scholars from leading business schools around the world. And indeed, I already used the chat function and put in some links that I will refer to now. My brilliant colleague, Pascal Chavaz, says one link is wrong. She will correct that. So stay tuned. First, let me say a few words about the two institutions I'm affiliated with. The NYU Stern Center for Business Human Rights and the Geneva Center for Business Human Rights. And I actually split my time between those two institutions. Stern Center was founded in April 2013. The director of the center, Professor Michael Posner, brought the idea of human rights and business education to Stern based on his experience as the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor in the first Obama administration. And dealing with governments and private actors, he saw the need to bring human rights as a key dimension for business success to business schools. I joined Stern in the same year as the research director, and over the course of the past 8 years, we have developed a strong portfolio of rigorous research into industry-specific human rights challenges. We currently work on construction, manufacturing, tech, and investment. We, for example, look deeply into the labor rights situation of garment workers in Bangladesh. After all, our center was launched in 2013, just a few weeks before the Rana Plaza tragedy happened, and it was the emblematic business and human rights challenge where we felt we need to investigate further. We need to understand how our current business models in the fashion industry drive systemic human rights risks into these supply chains. So in Geneva, where I founded the Geneva Center for Business Human Rights in 2019, we essentially do the same than in New York, but with the different focus areas, industry focus areas. We're currently working on extractives, finance, agriculture, and security. Our most advanced project focuses on the cobalt supply chain from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And there we want to understand how can we make sure that cobalt, an essential battery mineral, which we need to produce our electric vehicles, and which are critical for meeting climate change targets, how can we make sure that we can source this critical battery mineral from a country with incredibly weak rule of law in a responsible way? So in each industry context, we want to understand how do current business models in companies' core business operations affect human rights? And this impact can be both positive and negative. With our research, we want to support businesses in the development of business models that systematically make a positive impact by aligning profits and principles. And we publish our research findings as reports with clear recommendations for companies and policymakers. So second, let me elaborate a bit on how we do our work. All our research projects and our research questions come from practice. We are phenomenon driven. Our research questions are based on real business challenges. We then conduct original research and we collect our own data with interviews and typically also research trips to the field. Well, in the past 18 months, this has been challenging, and I think we need to think how to innovate and become part of local networks that can help us to conduct the research in the field. We're currently trying this in the context of a project on human rights in the agriculture sector to assess the implications of the pandemic on the coffee and sugar supply chain in India with the help of local Indian academic institutions. And that's, I think, really a win-win setup. Then we publish our results in an accessible format. I've mentioned these reports that we self-publish. So unlike most academics, we're not focused on academic journal publications or publishing books. From my experience, corporate practitioners don't read these, and we want to be read. We want the stakeholders that are supposed to implement our recommendations to see them and pick them up. These reports, as I mentioned before, conclude with recommendations for companies and policymakers. And from those recommendations, we derive an advocacy agenda from our research based on these recommendations. So everything starts with rigorous research, but then we transition into an advocacy phase to ensure that our work actually has real world impact. And then we want to bring our research back into education. So we develop teaching tools, including case studies. Recently, I've drafted a micro simulation, which worked really well during this time of online teaching. I think it's important that we always figure out how can the research come back to the classroom and facilitate teaching and advancing the skills of our students. With this specific research approach, we hope to generate research that has real world impact and advances human rights in corporate practice. Third, it's important to note that we don't want to do that alone. As Mr. Haverman said, we are currently the two only institutions worldwide fully established at business schools that focus on human rights. We don't want to be the only ones forever. So actually in 2017, we created a network of schools that now comprises almost 100 business schools from around the world. Since last year, we're also partnering with the GBSN, that's the Global Business School Network, to manage our work, and together with the GBSN's director, Dan Leclerc, Mike Posner, and I put together the toolkit that was mentioned in the introduction. So this toolkit comprises resources for the institutionalization of business human rights in business schools, but it also pools research outlets and teaching resources. It makes the case for human rights in business education. And to summarize a bit from the toolkit, here are key drivers for business human rights at business schools. First of all, I'm typically following the list of skills that the World Economic Forum puts out there for the future of work. So what skills do our students need if they want to be successful in the future world of work? And always on top over the past years are analytical and critical thinking skills, as well as leadership skills. And I would argue that those skills can ideally be taught with business human rights classes that ask students to take a step back and assess the bigger picture of their environment in which they do business. So instead of looking at business as islands that maximize profits, I think they need to link better with the ecosystem in which they operate. And teaching business human rights gives them this broader perspective, teaches them leadership skills and analytical and critical thinking skills. Second, more opportunistically, is that now business school accreditation organizations have become more strict in understanding how business schools actually implement their missions. Many business schools today have missions that include responsible management, but often it's just a ceremonial adoption of a trending topic, and it's not truly put into practice. And business school accreditation organizations now want to see proof what you're actually doing to put your commitment to responsible management into practice. And of course, the integration of human rights in the business school curriculum is one way of showing that you're doing that. At the same time, research funding organizations, I think that has been a really accelerated development recently. They're more and more interested in research with impact. I think business human rights research is ideal for showing this, because this is why we all engage in this. And then fourth, arguably most importantly, is because students demand it. My classes in Geneva are full. I taught a business human rights class for the first time 3 years ago. I got a classroom for 30 people. 70 showed up. In the end, there were 100. Last semester, I taught 140 students, and they choose to be there. So I see a huge interest in these type of topics that go beyond a narrow understanding of the purpose of business. And then lastly, I want to come back to what I earlier said. I believe for business schools to be successful long-term, they need to remain relevant. So it's important that business school education is not perceived as an ivory tower exercise, but instead they need to make an effort to close the gap between what they teach currently and what is happening in the world, and the world is evolving and developing really fast at the moment. So since this year, Michael Posner and I are also co-leading the PRIME working group for business human rights. Many of you might be already familiar with PRIME. PRIME are the Principles for Responsible Management Education. It's a sub-initiative of the UN Global Compact. The network comprises more than 800 business schools, which is of course fantastic for us because it allows us to reach out to an even larger group with this idea. And the PRIME is also linked to the UN Global Compact that has 8,000 businesses worldwide signed up that are, at least in principle, committing to those 10 principles of the UN Global Compact. So lastly, just a word on how to integrate business human rights in the curriculum. I think what we've seen, what is not working, is to simply add a class in which then some interested students learn more about something that they're interested in anyway, and something that they're already convinced of. So you're teaching to the choir, you're teaching in a silo without making connections to the other core classes that are taught at business school. So instead, we're suggesting in our toolkit to create a red thread that frames the entire business school program with a human rights lens. And for this, we need to figure out what does business human rights mean for the subdisciplines of management? What is business human rights for accounting, for finance, marketing, supply chain management, etc. And we've just gone through that exercise in Geneva, because in the fall, we're launching a new master's program on responsible management. It's called the Master for Responsible Management, where I'm in the scientific committee, and we've talked to all the instructors in the program to help them integrate aspects of responsible management and human rights into their existing programs. So to create that red thread throughout the program versus just adding a class. So let me conclude with the commitment that the biggest companies in the US made pretty much exactly 2 years ago. The Business Roundtable in the US, an organization that comprises the CEOs of the biggest companies, 2 years ago changed the definition of the purpose of the corporation to make explicit that a corporation has to serve all stakeholders and create value for business and society. And this is a big commitment. If this statement should not just remain empty rhetoric, then business schools have a key role to play to support its implementation. So we hope through New York and Geneva to build a movement of business schools that support the integration of human rights in business education, to create the economy that we want. So if this is something that you want to be part of, then please reach out to us and sign up for our group. I think Pascal will put in the correct sign-up link again, and we can then discuss more how to advance this agenda. I look forward to your comments and questions now. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So Professor Doherty, thanks so much for this passionate presentation of yours, and congratulations on the tenure. So it's great that you will be in this field for a long time to come. Yeah, on personal story, I did 30 years ago business administration, and there was not a single word about business and human rights. It was all about return on investment. And most of my classmates, they're all in companies, and they're looking very weird at me that I joined the United Nations. So I think these fields really need to come together, and we're making a great progress. So the floor is open for questions. So if somebody has a question, please raise your hand or type it in the box. But I'll kick it off. So yeah, Professor Doherty mentioned, no, Asian business schools are underrepresented. So it's a bit the question. So I would say, what are the challenges that we are observing, starting this, incorporating this in curricula in this region? And what can we do extra, I would say. And maybe, I don't know, the ambassador is still here as well. So maybe the ambassador wants to answer. But first I wanted to ask the professor from the Hong Kong University, Professor Deva, can you maybe comment on that one first?
Thank you. Thank you, Dorothy, for excellent presentation, and thank you for the question. I think it's not merely the business schools, but I would say the education, whether at the law schools or business schools, BHR is very thin in Asia Pacific, unfortunately, at this point of time. If we look at the scholars in business and human rights, which are part of the network, global networks on teaching or research, you will not find many active scholars from Asia Pacific. So I think that is a big deficit in my view. So I think we need to nurture more scholars who are not writing merely in the local context of their country. Rather, they are writing in the context of the global landscape and situating it. And when I say Asia Pacific, I'm not putting focus on Australia and New Zealand or some other countries like Japan and elsewhere. But I think that is my sense. That's one difficulty. The second issue that I find is that, and I think Dorothy may disagree with this, that the business case for human rights is part of the problem. We teach at business schools how to make money, and there's nothing wrong with that. But do you make money and do you use human rights as a tool to make more money? That's where I struggle. And I think that is the struggle not only of the business schools, that is also a struggle of the global compact companies. That is also the struggle of the BHR discourse. That is also the struggle of the governments. We have 25 governments adopting a national action plan. But how much has changed on the ground for the rights holders? Not much. You can look at the report of the working group on the 10 years anniversary that we presented and the roadmap that we're developing. So the reality is this, that there is a lot of in principle, on paper commitment to do good. And I think I hear, Ambassador, this every time, smart thing to do and all that. That is a good message for some companies, but it doesn't work for each and every company. And I think unless we make human rights as a precondition of doing business, rather than a business case, we will not make a transformative change. And I think that should be part of this changing the paradigm at business schools, in my view, also the law schools. Because when I teach a course on business and human rights at the law schools, these students have already done corporate law, company law. And as part of company law, when they come to my class, they believe in shareholder primacy very strongly. So their minds are already polluted when they come to me in year 3 or 4. And it takes me a couple of classes to bring them to the center that at least, look, shareholder primacy may not be even legally correct. It's not there. And even if it is legally there, we need to tweak it significantly. So I think these are my reflections. Thank you very much, Patrick, for the questions.
Okay, Ambassador N, you want to comment at this point? And we have also 3 people raising their hands. So the next round we do the 3 questions. Ambassador, you want to go on in at this point or later on? Oh, you cannot unmute yourself.
Yeah, let's see if I can unmute myself. No, I really don't have much to add. I'm not an expert in how to include responsible business in curricula at business schools, but I stayed to listen and learn from the presentations of Professor Deva and Professor Baumann, and I think they were really rich and important, and I picked up a lot of things as you did on important aspects in going ahead. I think from our side, the only thing that we can share as a government is our commitment to the agenda, and also why we do support such a project. And I agree with Professor Deva that I mean, human rights are principles. Governments has to abide by international our international normative framework. So human rights are important in themselves to follow. But I still think there's a strong case for businesses, and that is our lesson in Sweden, that businesses will benefit also in their success if they focus more on social dialogue and the rights and sustainable agendas in their business models and in how they work vis-a-vis their workers. So I think there was a lot of good comments on when you look at this in Vietnam. Of course, you have to start in the local context, otherwise it doesn't make sense. And you have to look for good examples, both already existing in Vietnam and in neighboring countries. And I think something that Professor Baumann lifted on taking a starting point in the need for analytical and critical thinking is also important. I mean, it's not only a package to teach. It's starting by asking yourself questions and what needs to be done in this context. And so you look around and you see what is needed when it comes to companies' responsibility in climate change, when it comes to social responsibility and so on. And from there you encourage and you promote the dialogue on how future business leaders can take on that responsibility. Yeah.
Okay. No. Thanks for that comment as well. Yeah. The next round of questions. So I think it's 3 hands. So we start on Mr. Lang with the camera on. Then I see Lang Nok, also the camera on, and then we have Thuy Dong. So we take 3 together, and then the panel can respond. Is that okay? Mr. Lang, the floor is yours for your question. Can we unmute the person who's gonna ask the question? We can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself, or can somebody unmute? Mr. Lang?
Yes. Okay. Now that's okay.
Okay.
Nice
okay.
to meet you. Yeah, nice to meet you. I thank you very much, Mr. Chair and distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here to listen to your my excellent presentation. They are very comprehensive and progressive presentation for Vietnam context. And I think this the new concept maybe a responsible cooperation, or maybe social responsible, and maybe sustainable cooperation are new concept for Vietnam. And I would like to respect the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of United Nations. Firstly, I would like to I highly appreciate the excellent presentation from Deva. Deva say about firstly, we should respect the human rights. I completely agree with him, and we cannot trade off between the human rights and maybe profit maximization. I think it's a good principle. And the second one, I think is in Vietnam and some neighboring countries like Cambodia and Laos, sometimes we can use the maybe childhood and maybe people with a disability, or maybe forced labor. I think it's maybe we violate human rights. I think it is sometimes that. So now if we establish the responsible cooperation, that's very good for Vietnam and for other countries. And if we provide this education, maybe we can teach not only in Vietnam but in other countries. And the second one, I would like to I'd like to thank to my Professor Dorothy Bermuth. She's very interested in the toolkit or maybe instrument to run the responsible cooperation in Vietnam. Now we lack or shortage of such the instrument and toolkits to establish the curriculum and to run the social and maybe responsible cooperation. It is very good for Vietnam. but I think if we establish as soon as possible the curriculum for this program, education program, I think the first one you can put the human rights, chapter 1, okay, and maybe main principle for this for this enterprise, for this concept. And I think the next chapter, I think we can should focus on the context, local context, think globally but act locally. So try to understand the Vietnamese context and some other neighboring Vietnam country. And the first one, I think maybe some instrument and maybe mechanism. I highly appreciate all your presentation, and I learned a lot and get a lot of information from the presenter. But the question to Diva, whether or not you can provide some maybe advice for Vietnam, whether or not we develop this the subjects fastly or maybe slowly to cap up with the Vietnamese context now. Do you understand my question, Deva? Okay.
Yeah, so we take a couple of questions together. So thanks for the compliment for the speaker and for the question.
One more question for.
I think we do one question per person. We have some other people.
One question per person. Yeah. Okay. No. And one Polly. Okay, Polly. I have like one question for you. What's the most important tool? One instrument, most important tool or instrument to run the responsible company in Vietnam. For example, use the case study or maybe some qualitative or quantitative instrument to do research or to maybe to manage this cooperation. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, good.
So we hand it over to the next question, Lang Nok, from the NEU. Go ahead. Can you unmute yourself? Yeah, no.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So finally. So good afternoon, professors and all the participants of our workshop today. So I'm Lan Ngọc from the National Economics University. I have two questions for Professor Bowman about the toolkit. Okay, the first question relating to the integration, the approach to integrate human rights issue into different courses in business school. So do you think that insertion of human rights issues into existing courses is more challenging or more effective than designing a totally new course focusing on human rights issues and other issues of responsible business? Because asking all the lecturers in the other subject to add new thing in what they already master is not easy for several years. That's the first question. The second question related to the teaching and learning methodology. So in the toolkit, you and the members advise us to apply the experiential learning and immersive pedagogies. So it's like students have internships or doing projects in real business, right? So do you think that it's quite hard for students? So it's not easy for them to contact a business and say that I want to study about human rights in your company. So is it? I don't think it's possible, as I think. And furthermore, in a short time for internship or project is about 2 or 3 months maximum. So can students realize and then analyze the human rights issues that might exist in that business? So that's two of my questions. Thank you.
Okay, and we take one more person asking one question, or maybe two. Le Thuy Dong, go ahead, unmute yourself and ask the question. Yeah, go ahead. I cannot hear you. Can the others hear the speaker? No. There's something with the microphone, but it shows unmute. So look at the technology, and we hand it over first to Professor Doherty to then answer the first two questions. And then
sorry, anh Nghị Dũng bật mic lên cho Dương nhé, Lê Thị Dương. Dạ. Hello anh Nghị Dũng. Yeah.
Thủy Dương bật rồi nhưng mà chắc là mic của Thủy Dương có vấn đề em ạ.
Thủy Dương chỉnh lại mic đi em xem.
We can ask. Yeah, but TRIliwong, your microphone is not working. I think it's your computer. It's not working. So let's end the question. So let's go back to the professors to give some answers, and we do the second round. So check your technology. We're coming back to you, and also to the other person who wanted to ask a question. Professor Dorothy.
Thanks. Excellent question on how to best integrate human rights aspects into the curriculum. I made the case that a standalone course alone is insufficient, and rather advise to integrate human rights aspects throughout the program in the core courses of management, because human rights shouldn't be seen as sort of a separate add-on. I think we have that experience from teaching corporate social responsibility, and it was reflective of how corporate social responsibility was seen by businesses, namely something that you do if you have time and money left over. But the idea of business human rights is to change how we do business and how we make money. So that's why it should also in business education be part of those core management courses that are being taught from marketing, finance, accounting, supply chain management, etc. And it is difficult sometimes to convince instructors to take on new things, but in the conversation, you can clarify it's actually not such a big ask, because often they already teach case studies. They can use the same case study to also highlight the human rights aspect in the specific case, something for which they probably just didn't have a specific lens yet. And so it's just putting on those lenses that human rights implications should be part of the discussion throughout the program. We're trying this now in Geneva. Of course, some instructors are more open to do more than others that don't want to change much or anything. So I'm not saying it's easy, but I believe it needs both. It needs the integration in every course. And then it does make sense to still have a separate class on business human rights to tie the strings together, from the different courses and deepen the knowledge. So it's not either or. Ideally, you're able to deliver on both, but not all schools have the expertise to deliver a class on business human rights. And so instead, bringing, and the curriculums are overcrowded already. There are a lot of new themes. So I think most schools might be best advised to figure out how to make it part of the established program, to also show to students, we want to produce responsible managers, and it features in all those separate courses. Your second question was about immersive teaching approaches, which I'm really excited about, and there will be more time to talk about the teaching this afternoon for you with my colleague Ingrid Landau. But I think the more you can put students in actual decision-making situations, the better. So I also do role plays, not just case studies, which is sort of the dominant way of teaching in business schools. I like role plays. I really enjoyed this micro simulation. And yes, if students can also do internships with companies, that's fantastic. And it doesn't have to be an internship on human rights specifically. Often things are not termed human rights that actually have human rights aspects. So I also tell my students in my business human rights class, what you're learning here might not be immediately relevant in your first job. It typically becomes relevant in your 7th job as you're taking on leadership responsibility and you're touching upon these human rights aspects in a more significant way. But if you're doing an internship, in a garment factory, then human rights aspects will be infused, most likely also in your internship, even if it doesn't have human rights management in the title. And so just alerting students that it's part of curricular management, I think is useful.
Thank you very much for your answers about that. So I can find a lot of detail very effective in the toolkits, so I can spend more time on that. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Okay,
I don't hesitate to reach out again, so we can also continue bilaterally.
Okay, from Geneva back to Hong Kong for the question raised to Professor Surya. over to you, and then the next round of questions.
Thank you. I think Dorothy partly answered this question, but I will be brief about the pace. How do you integrate BHR curricula courses in Vietnam? What should be the pace? Fast, do it slowly. My sense is that there is no one ideal way of doing it. You have to look at the local context. How many courses, how many credits are allowed, right? Is there a space for a separate course? Because there are competing demands in curriculum and all this, right? So I don't want to sound unrealistic. Rather, my suggestion is look at the local context. If it is not possible to have an independent course, having a couple of lectures, couple of seminars in different courses could be a good starting point. Then later on, you can build on that, and that could be expanded as a thread, as Dorothy was talking about. You can have specialized courses, you can introduce seminars, if not a full course, right? And of course, there is a scope for having a minor, a major on a full program. So I mean, sky is the limit, how much you can do. But I think we should not be the one telling you at what pace you should be doing it. Rather, our role should be that these are our experiences and these are the options A, B, C, D. See if those options work for you, or you may come up with your own option based on the local context. Thank you.
Okay, so we move to the second round of questions. I think so we go to TործNG. Over to you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. My name is Thắng. I'm director of the Center for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the National Economic University. I'm also associate fellow to Cambridge Center for Social Innovation. So actually, I posed this question since yesterday's session. As the one who teach business ethics and CSR and social innovation for 15 years now. Actually, you know, listening to the presentations, all kind of concepts, you know, just come to my mind, like business ethics, CSR, you know, sustainable businesses, responsible management, and responsible business. So it's great if you know, any of the speakers can, you know, help to somewhat distinguish the barriers or overlaps between these concepts, because recently we, you know, I myself, I involved in different projects to embed like business ethics and teachings, and also embed CSR through the UN Global Compact with VCCI, Vietnam Chamber of Commerce, to teaching in Vietnam, but actually it was not successful. So, I would like, I'd love that we discuss the reason why it was not successful. And so the first question is, you know, about the different concept, and the second one is perhaps we can have sometimes discuss about how to embed these into teaching in Vietnam, because to me it's really great to see like different approach of similar concept now are having attentions and efforts from different stakeholders to make it, you know, real and happen in Vietnam. So from my experience, because I am the one who applied for a French business school here in Vietnam to be the only PROM signatory from Vietnam since 2008 up to now. The only motivations that I found, which is appropriate to Vietnamese business school, is through the requirement of accreditation. It's really, you know, internal motivations for them to embed, you know, similar concept of CSR, business ethics, and responsible management into teaching. So just the first question is about the concept, and the second is about some, you know, feedback and the realities in Vietnam. Thank you.
Good. So questions. Yeah, so I think the person who didn't have the speaker working still figured out the speaker working. If so, please speak up, and otherwise we pass on this question let's do the reverse order. Let's first go to Professor Deva in Hong Kong, and then after that, Professor Dorothy to answer on this question.
Thank you. These are excellent questions. So I will reflect on the different concepts question and then pass it on to Dorothy. I think I tried to explain some of the differences, but I would submit that these differences sometimes are difficult to explain, also because none of these concepts have a universally acceptable definition. What is CSR? What is RBC? What is BHR? What is sustainability? We may disagree. So if we can disagree on these different concepts, fundamental definition, then differentiating one from the another is going to be an ongoing challenge in my view. But I think I tried to explain in my slides that some of those differences could be made. But I would like to highlight a practical consideration based on my experiences in the global South, in particular in Asia. Many governments and many companies in Asia do not feel comfortable with the idea of human rights. So they don't buy yet to the idea of business and human rights. So human rights term is problematic for many governments and many companies. Even if they don't say it publicly, privately they tell us this. And because of this, I know for myself that certain projects don't use BHR. They may call it sustainability. They may call it responsible business conduct. Even if they want to do BHR, they will not use that label. So I think we have to be aware of those practical considerations as well. For instance, in China, you can't talk about BHR because the human rights term is there. So then they're talking about CSR 2.0. That this is a new kind of CSR. So you talk about these issues, but use a different label. So I think we can keep on debating those different concepts and distinctions. But my real point was that let us keep the goal in mind. And I think the goal in mind is this, that businesses are not there in society merely to make money. And there are different pathways to change the business culture. And unless we change the business culture and business models, and many things may need to change. Even accounting standards have to change, for instance, because these quarterly pressures to show the profit going up, up, up is highly problematic. And how we define profit. So I think these are the wider questions that I think we need to grapple with. Thank you.
Yeah, it's, Dorothy, you want to speak on this one, and Professor Deva, for you is the other question. The audio wasn't working, but it's in the chat box. So first Dorothy, and if Professor in Hong Kong can read the chat box, and then answer afterwards. Dorothy, over to you.
Sure, just briefly. Thanks, TANC, for your excellent questions, and I really appreciated Surya's comments on we also have to be pragmatic. If human rights language doesn't work, let's stay focused on what we're actually trying to achieve here, namely to advance human rights in corporate practice. And if you have to call it sustainability, it's sustainability. I was most intrigued by your comment, though, that you've already tried this integration with business ethics, and it didn't really work. And I understand, because I have a business ethics background. So I've also experienced, a decade of how do we make sure that these conversations are driven through the program and cascaded through each chorus. I think for today is easier than still 10 years ago. Also because the world develops in a direction that makes the case to making the case much easier. As businesses are struggling with human rights challenges, which they need to address to remain successful, it's getting easier to make the case for integrating human rights, and it's more concrete than ethics broadly. But very pragmatically, what certainly helped at NYU Stern in Geneva was exceptional leadership support from the deans at the business schools that believed in this and the need for a a broader business purpose definition and a different business approach. It was thanks to those deans that the two centers were created, and we could do the type of research that we do, and which doesn't fit into the classic parameters of what typically is required for business school faculty.
Okay.
Does it answer your question? Like, you let me know.
And then over to Professor Deva, the question you read it in the chat box. Now, does the UN guiding principle set?
I think I read the question.
Okay.
Thank you. Just to save time, thank you, Patrick. So I think the questions are, and I will try to be brief again. The first question is whether there are any new obligations imposed by UN guiding principles. The answer is both yes and no. The guiding principles claim that they are not creating something new. Because if you say you're creating something new, then states and companies may not be willing to accept it. So I think they try to have this narrative that we are merely clarifying the standards. So I think especially in relation to Pillar 1, they're not creating new obligations, but they're clarifying what the state should be doing as part of Pillar 1. But when it comes to businesses, I think they are setting standards. I would say human rights due diligence is something new as a package. It was there earlier, but it was not really called human rights due diligence as a 4-step process. So I think that is definitely a new dimension, but it is not an obligation. Though it is becoming an obligation now because of these national legislation that I was referring to. In my view, and coming to the second question, I think we're talking about a smart mix here. So it's not binding versus or binding or voluntary approaches. Rather, we need everything. We need legal regulation and binding regulation and effective enforcement of it. But we also need voluntary approaches. We also need moral approaches and ethical approaches. So we need everything on the table together, in my view. Thank you.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of the session. So I think it was a very practical session. I think two professors explaining rightly how you can integrate business and human rights in the curricula and having good examples of how it all works. We still have a lot of questions about different definitions, I think. But at the same time, we're saying as well, keep the eye on the ball and be pragmatic and move forward the agenda. Yeah, in the next session, I think moderated by Diana, it's more from the Vietnamese perspective, how we're going to go about it with the National Economics University. So for now, I wanted to thank everybody, and I believe we have a 10-minute break. So go stretch your legs, and then in 10 minutes we're back, and my colleague Diana is the moderator for the next session. Thanks so much. Thanks for the ambassador of Sweden, and thanks for Professor Dorothy and Professor Deva. It was an excellent session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I greatly enjoyed it.
Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
reach over 200,000%. Driving growth or in checking life, looking toward recovery, but will recovery work for everyone? 70%, only 26% of business have women in operation. 54% personal development, 86% takes on from work weeks, and 7% of workers say, and now COVID-19, 5 million worker households to 12 and health care. Vietnam cannot afford to continue with business as usual and never business. 2021 and the will for better, safe working conditions, increase well-being and increase productivity. Business meaning great diversity and inclusive workplace. They have 45% higher revenue. Gender diversity and inclusion is having 15% higher profit. Already require that we work together, diversity accelerate work, invest in the future of Vietnam. Responsible business 2021. Responsible business.
Các anh ơi, mình có thể dừng video clip để bắt đầu chuyển sang section 2 được không ạ? Anh cảm ơn ạ. So Diana, are you there? Yes, I think we are ready to start the session 2. Yes, thank you.
Yes, sorry, I was unable to unmute myself. The host was controlling the mic. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. It's so great to see you. I hope you hear me well. Can you please give me yeah, great. A signal that you can hear me very well. Thank you so much. So we are going to start the next segment of our workshop for today, and the last section, and the last segment for the day, I guess. So welcome again after the break, and it's really great to see so many participants still connected and interested. We still have a great superstar lineup of speakers for the afternoon. So please stay tuned. There is still lots to learn and share this afternoon. My name is Diana Torres. I am the head of governance and participation in UNDP, and I will be moderating this session in the afternoon. From the previous session, we heard some speakers talking about the framework and the toolkit for applying responsible business and human rights principles into higher education curricula. And now we'll hear from the experiences of curriculum integration from 2 distinguished professors that we have invited for today. It is my great honor to introduce to you Dr. Ingrid Landau, who is a lecturer in the Department of Business Law and Taxation at the Monash Business School and a member of the Labor, Equality and Human Rights Research Group. Dr. Landau teaches employment law and human rights and global business, and she has expertise in corporate labor and human rights, due diligence regulation, socially responsible public procurement, and labor regulation in the Asia Pacific. Especially, she also has a background in working and studying about Vietnam. And she has undertaken numerous consultancies for the Hanoi offices of the ILO, International Labour Organization. Dr. Ingrid will speak about integrating responsible business with human rights lens, not only in the curriculum, but also in extracurriculum activities at the University of Monash in Australia. She will also share hands-on experiences in developing and testing and teaching human rights and global business courses, as well as why do we need business school to teach human rights. So Dr. Ingrid, welcome, and thank you again for joining us. The floor is yours. Thank you. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Diana. and thank you to the UNDP for inviting me today. I'm really pleased to participate in this workshop because it brings together two things that are close to my heart, which is teaching business and human rights and Vietnam. I studied, when I was at university, I studied in Hanoi and I try and work there wherever possible, but I'm ashamed to say my Vietnamese is not as good as it used to be. I will be delivering this in English, and my apologies for that. In the brief time I have available, I wanted to talk briefly about some of the context of our business school, Monash Business School, which is the largest business school in Australia, about how we've kind of tackled issues around responsible business, teaching responsible business. And then I want to look at kind of very at a practical level about my experiences in introducing what was the first business and human rights unit in a business school in Australia. We have not been nearly as quick on this as Europe, I guess. So my unit, which I introduced 2 years ago now, was the first human rights unit in a business school. So I do have some slides, which I'll just share with you now. Okay, just a moment. Okay. Okay, can everyone see them? Yep, I hope so. So just a bit of context about Monash first. Monash Business School, as I said, is the largest business school in Australia. We also have campuses in China, Indonesia, South Africa and Italy, strangely enough. And responsible business is kind of integrated into the mission of the business school, which is that we engage in the highest quality research and education to have a positive impact on a changing world. And it is also integrated into our values. We are a very young business school, even though until 2014 we were a faculty of the university. And we've kind of shifted to try and to become a business school. We have around 21,000 students and over 400 kind of academics. So it's quite a large business school in our context. The main vehicle through which Monash Business School is engaged in responsible business is through Prime. And so it's really helpful that Professor Bowman-Pauly has already mentioned the UN Global Compact and its PRME initiative. So you don't have to worry about the text on the right of your screen. You can look at that later if you like. That's just a bit of a timeline. But we became a Prime signatory in 2010. And we used kind of the Prime as a vehicle both to promote, I guess, our activities outside, but also to drive change within the business school itself in our education and our research. And the business school is also very strongly committed to the Sustainable Development Goals and uses that as a framework as well. Okay, so we've already talked a bit about whether to integrate business and human rights into the curricula broadly or to have specialist units. I feel strongly that we should do both, and I'm pleased that Monash Business School does that. We have a range of specialist units which go to responsible business, and I've just listed some of those for you on the slide. We also try and integrate responsible business perspectives into generalist units within our 7 departments. So our 7 departments include, for example, economics, marketing, business law, accounting, banking and finance, and so on. In 2018, we also kind of for the first time, shows that we're still very much kind of starting this journey, tried to map all our courses and our units against kind of the Prime principles and the SDGs to try and get an idea of how it all cohered and fit together. And that was a very big exercise, but a very important one. And I think achieving kind of integration of business and human rights and responsible business across the business school is still a key challenge, and we can talk more about that later if you like. Students can also choose responsible business specializations as majors, basically within particular courses that they can do. And we also offer a Master of Environment and Sustainability, which is a new kind of forward-looking but very popular master's. We also rely quite heavily on on delivering degrees and units in cooperation with other faculties and centres within the university. And I think that really helps us I guess, increase our expertise in the area and leverage kind of resources that other centres and departments may have as well. We also have a range of kind of initiatives, prime initiatives that kind of are directed at trying to integrate these principles more into our business school. Each department has a prime ambassador. So for example, I was the ambassador for the Department of Business Law. That's responsible for promoting and encouraging activities within the department and the school more broadly around these principles, and for raising awareness, which is still a challenge. We also have an annual Dean's Awards for Prime Education Excellence. This image and the interview, which you can read later if you like, is a colleague of mine, Dr. Machernia, who won the award last year. And again, this is just kind of an incentive and a reminder to staff, to faculty, to think about how they're integrating responsible business into what they teach. And for example, Dr. Machernia teaches business law mostly, so he integrates it into that. We also have a newsletter now fortnightly, which is another recent initiative which talks about kind of research, analysis, events, and so on within the business school, but with a real focus on contemporary problems and trying to find socially responsible business solutions to those problems. So these are just a couple of examples of the initiatives that we've tried to put in place. Student engagement, I think, is a really important part of integrating business and human rights into business schools. We have a range of kind of initiatives that are directed at trying to get students more interested in the issues and more active. And I've just, again, listed two examples there. These PowerPoints, which I believe will be made available to you, have embedded links. So if you're interested, you should be able to follow the links on any of these initiatives to find out more. Okay, so I want to talk, I guess, for the rest of the brief time I have available on my Human Rights and Global Business unit and some of my experiences in introducing this. So when I joined Monash University in 2017, I taught employment law and business law, but I was very fortunate when I did my PhD to actually go and I was invited to, as part of a doctoral scholar program, to the NYU Stanford Center, the NYU Center for Business and Human Rights, where I met Professor Bowman-Pauly and the director of that center, Mike Posner. And that was really, for me, an inspiration. And I came back very much thinking that we needed to have business and human rights units in Australian business schools. I won't go into why I think this is necessary. I have a link on the slide to an article that I wrote for our business school impact newsletter on why I think business schools need to teach human rights, but also because I think both professors, Professor Deva and Professor Bowman-Pauly really explained this really well, and I agree 100% with their explanations. But I do think, I guess, from an Asia Pacific perspective, that I felt strongly that, and a lot of the discussions, the conversations, the initiatives were very North American and European dominated. And I wanted to try and introduce a unit that focused more on our region. And while I understand that, you know, in the Australian context, it is in some ways different to, for example, Southeast Asia, the reality is the students I teach are, the vast majority are from Southeast Asia and China and India. And the vast majority of those students have done their undergraduate education in those countries, not in Australia. So I think some of the challenges around this we do share. Because I've got a law background, my unit adopts a kind of regulatory focus. So we focus a lot on the law. The other thing I wanted to mention was how I tried to convince the senior membership within the business school that this was a good idea. I found the Business and Human Rights Toolkit, which Dorothy's already mentioned and given you a link to, really useful in, I guess, in garnering and articulating some of the arguments. I found it very useful to point to, when conversations with kind of senior leadership, to point to the increasing number of other business schools that were teaching business and human rights. I don't know if it's the same in Vietnam, but in Australia, business schools are very concerned with their rankings and how they compare with other business schools and other universities. So it was really useful to be able to point at top kind of business schools around the world and within the region, and say these schools are teaching business and human rights. We really should now too. After that, after I got approval to run the unit, firstly on a kind of pilot, one-off kind of trial, and it was very successful. And so I've been teaching it basically twice a year since then, once in a semester-long program and once in an intensive 6-week program. Again, you don't need to read this now, but this is kind of for your information, gives you an idea of what I try and achieve with the unit. So this is our learning outcomes that I work towards ensuring that the students meet by the end of the unit, and it's a 12-week unit. So a lot of it goes to understanding key concepts and debates in relation to corporate accountability and human rights. I spend quite a lot of time, we spend quite a lot of time talking about the differences between business and human rights and CSR and business ethics, because I find that the students are generally, particularly those from Asian countries, are familiar with CSR kind of concepts, but I find human rights even quite new. So when I first, for example, when I first time I taught the unit, my first week was on what's human rights got to do with business. And then it dawned on me in about week 3 that students did not really understand what human rights were from an international law perspective. So I've now kind of adjusted the unit. So the first couple of weeks, we do spend quite a lot of time talking about what are human rights, you know, which kind of standards are human rights in international law and which are not, you know, and so on, before we get on to the actual business and human rights conversations. I try and encourage students to adopt very critical view on the range of kind of whether they're business and human rights laws or initiatives, whether they're private initiatives, to learn how they work and where they came from, but also to critically evaluate them, to try and understand their strengths and weaknesses. And I also, I think, encouraging students to work collaboratively to identify strategies that to address practical challenges that business face is really important to the skills I believe that they will need in the workforce. And so we spend a lot of time on that. I should mention my unit is a master's unit, but a lot of the students have come all the way through the education system and they have not yet worked they're still in their studies, and particularly most of the students that are from Asia, I find have come straight from undergraduate degrees. But there's also a mix. I also have some students who are in quite senior positions in Australian-based companies. So it's a real kind of mix, but it actually makes for really interesting conversations and discussions in class. Again, just I guess for your information, this is the structure of the unit. I do structure the unit around the UN guiding principles that Professor Davis spoke about before, but I also encourage students to adopt a critical view of and to evaluate where the UN guiding principles and the approaches where they're useful and where they may fall short. As I mentioned before, I do try and have an Asia Pacific focus, and that is quite challenging because a lot of the material that is available in this area is, of teaching material at least, is produced in North America and Europe. So I'm really excited to have that if countries kind of in the region can develop kind of a regional networks on teaching business and human rights as well. I do have a number of industry spotlights that change every semester, basically. So there's general information, and then one week we might do an industry spotlight on privacy and freedom of communication in the ICT industry, for example, or we might do an industry spotlight on an area which is kind of very important in Australia, which is Indigenous and community rights in the extractive sector. So those spotlights I may change. What I want to focus on, just for the last, 1 minute, I'll be 1 minute, is the approach and assessment. I try to make it very practical oriented. I have a reflective writing assignment, which business students hate, but I think is really important. And this basically asks them to think about how what they're learning in the unit connects to the other subjects that they have learned and are learning about in business, and how learning about business and human rights is changing or is not changing. They can say that as well, how they think about business issues. And the other thing that I think is really important I have is a focus company. So each student has to, quite early on in the unit, choose a focus company, which is a real life company. They can choose a company that they work for, or that maybe is of interest to them because it's in an industry in which they want to work. And then when we learn about particular subjects, they need to apply what they're learning every week to their own focus company. And they have to write on that and comment on other students' posts. And then that focus company, becomes, all the research on their focus company becomes a focus company report, which is the major piece of assessment for the unit, which is worth 50%. And you have some really, students choose all kinds of companies, and I really enjoy kind of talking to them about their company. There's, some students choose, very, I guess, the usual suspects, Nike, Unilever, Nestle, but students also choose kind of other companies in the region. So, and I've just got 3 examples of student reports there. So we had an Indonesian student do research on Gojek, which is the Indonesian rideshare company. We had another student do Nippon Steel, another one did the Australian ANZ Bank, which I'm sure you're familiar with because there's ANZs in Vietnam. And so it's a real kind of, hopefully, it's my attempt to try and get them, encourage them to apply what they're learning as they go along. A couple of very brief things, students really enjoy the unit. It gets really high levels of satisfaction, so the university is happy, which is good for me. Importantly, they always say in the surveys at the end that they see it as really relevant to what they learn, to their working lives, and I think that is really important to me. And then I have some challenges on that slide as well. As I mentioned, my students come from all over, many countries in the world, but largely from the Asia Pacific. And they start with very different levels of understandings about human rights. Business students, I find, can be obviously often lack confidence about being critical about initiatives. So I try and encourage them to do that. And the final one is the building and maintaining industry connections, getting industry and companies into the classroom because the students love that, but that can be quite challenging on an ongoing basis. Thank you. That's it. Singaman.
Thank you, Sinkamon. Thank you, Dr. Landau. That was excellent, fantastic beer, very hands-on, practical, lively experience, and most important, your efforts in contextualizing the unit to the Asia Pacific region. I think that's super pioneer and important given the different backgrounds of the students that you receive every year. So thank you so much. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions and comments from participants, but hold them there. We'll open the floor during the QA session after the next presentation and speaker. So I would like to now warmly welcome Professor Nguyen Van Tan, who is the Dean of the Institute of Sustainable Development from the National Economics University and the team leader of UNDP and the NEU research team, who will introduce responsible business and develop the training materials to the curriculum of NEU. Professor Fang presented on day one, and he's now speaking about his experience with integrating responsible business and human rights into the business school curriculum at NEU. Professor Tan, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Diane Torres. It's very happy for me here to talk about our experience. But firstly, I need to say that I enjoy tremendously the presentation so far from international professors, because this presentation gives us a lot of insights for our programs. Let me talk a little bit about the National Economics University. We offer various programs on economics and businesses. And at each point, we have about 24,000 undergraduate and about 3,000 graduate students on business and economics. So that means anything we do will have influence on many, many people in the new generation of business leaders. And that put us a little bit of pressure that how can we influence the new generation of business leaders on sustainable development, on responsible business, right? So in the past year, with support from the Swedish government and UNDP, we formed a team from the institute, my Institute of Sustainable Development, and from the School of Trade and International Economics. We study on how can we teach responsible business in the context of Vietnam, right? Today, I want to share with you a little bit of experience. We are still working on it, and we made some progress, but there's still more work to do, right? So let me share the screen, and I start with my presentation. Okay. I will talk a little bit about how we conceptualize responsible business in the Vietnamese context, because as both Professor Deva and Lando said, the context is very important, right? In order for us to teach any concept effectively. Then I share our experience of how we integrate the concept and the practices in the program so far. And then I share some consideration for anyone who want to do the same as us. So here's the context. Right? Anyone who care about Vietnam would know that Vietnam have enjoyed a very high growth rate before COVID-19, 6 or 7% every year. Right? Unfortunately, the high growth rate is creating a big pressure on social and environmental issues in Vietnam now. So for us as educators in business sector, it's very imperative to influence the business leader on sustainable development or responsible business practices. Another factor is that the business sector in Vietnam is dominated by small and medium-sized enterprises. Say like 99% of the firms are SMEs. And the operation of SME showed a growing concern on adverse impact on human rights and legitimate benefits of business stakeholders. So we think that anything we learn is important, but we need to adapt. So the cost should be relevant to SME as well, right? The third point in the context that I want to highlight is that the business program, well, most universities in Vietnam have business programs, and business programs already taught something like a business ethics or CSRs. Why do we need new courses on responsible business? That's the very first challenge. We should think how to convince our colleagues and our leader to it, right? So here's how we understand or how we conceptualize the responsible business. There are many definitions, some similar concepts here. We rely more on the UN OECD conceptualization of responsible business. But when we adopt to NEU, we bring the responsible business more than only human rights. Of course, human rights is the center of it. But like Professor David said, we want to broaden it a little bit. So responsible business to us is a business approach where a firm tries to achieve objectives, but at the same time respecting rights and legitimate benefits of related stakeholders, protecting the environment and adhering to business integrity values, right? When we talk about responsibility for a stakeholder, we mean at the very minimum, firms should not do harm to that stakeholder, right? That's the minimum. And whenever possible, a firm should contribute to the well-being of the stakeholder. That's what we mean, right? As we see the question yesterday and today, there's still some confusion or some inquiries on the concept. Of course, responsible business overlaps with similar concept on ethics or CSR. But we want to highlight three characteristics of the concept that we want to bring to students. First, responsible business is not additional practices that we introduce to businesses. We think responsible business is a cohesive approach where firm can use it for sustainable development, right? So responsible business is not additional burdens to the firm. The second thing is that responsible business requires manager to integrate, to hold responsibility to related stakeholders with the efficiency consideration, right? When they design business strategy and practices. So over time, that integration needs to be internalized to business leaders' values and to internalize to the operation function and daily operation, right? And the third point we think is very important, that in responsible business, there's no substitution. Doing good in one aspect cannot offset for the failure of doing no harm in others, right? So in a very nutshell, when we talk about CSRs, we talk about the firms can choose to do something nice. But when we talk about responsible business, we talk about the firm do all things right, right? So before you do anything nice, you need to do all the things right. And doing things right means that you respect the rights and the legitimate benefits of related stakeholders in every aspect of their business operation. Okay, so that's how we conceptualize responsible business in the context of Vietnam. But then, how can we teach it? Right? How can we teach this idea? There's several points that Professor already talked, that you need to be practical. It is experiential learning is good, but in the context of Vietnam, we would like, so far, I think this is very important, how we position the contents, how we position the course will influence the success of the course. And we think it's very important that we start from business point of view, that we convince the leader that how responsible business with human rights lens make business sense. Of course, moral sense we apply as well, but business needs to be convinced that this is a smart thing, like Professor already said, right? It's not only the right thing, but also a smart thing for business to do. Okay. So two things when we try to design the cost. First, we try to avoid this. We try to avoid that the cost appear to be imposing our values on business or putting more burdens on business. That's what we try to avoid. And we try to do, what we try to do is try to align the concept with popular business thinking models and tools that people already get used to. So we try to align them. And in fact, if we want this to be successful, they need to integrate the ideas of responsible business and human rights to the business operation. So we need to help people to align this. We have designed the courses. We developed some materials on this. The course have 3 blocks of the contents. The first block is the general concepts, the rationale, the concept, distinguishing between different concepts, why business should do it, all the general ideas there. The second block is the key. We explain the responsibilities to key stakeholders, including responsibilities of to employees. And here human rights come in greatly there. Right? Responsibilities to consumer, to communities, to government, and to environment, for example. So structure by stakeholder like this is easier for us to, for students to follow, and for us to bring ideas from law, from international convention, and from ethical norms to explain to students. Right? And the third block, we go back and say, so how can a business design their operation to integrate all this in their daily operation? Then we provide some tools like internal control systems, development of code of conduct, or standard operations procedure. So this is the structure of the contents that we do. So far, we have 2 modes of teaching these contents. One is try to integrate into existing courses. We talk to business ethics professor, principal management professors, and learning from Professor Bauman Pauli. Maybe leadership and analytical skills is also a relevant courses for integrating some ideas on human rights and responsible business. The second mode is that we create 2 new courses for new programs. Right? We have a new program on market surveillance. Then we have a course on responsible management. 70% of the contents are responsible business. Right? We have a new program on agricultural business program. Then in that program, we have a course on ethics and responsibility in agricultural business. Again, 60 to 70% of the contents are about responsible business, but it is tailored to agricultural business. I think I skipped this. We mostly have planned for teaching undergraduate program 2022, because right now the new program is launching. We have planned to teach at the master level. We call executive master program. We think about short-term training, but we don't have a clear plan for that yet. So what are some considerations for anyone in Vietnam who want to do similar to what we have been doing? Here are some considerations for you. The number 1, how can you convince your leaders that this course we need to shift from, well, not only shift, but this course is a good addition to business ethics and CSR courses that you have, right? So convince your leaders is the first challenge, because the other 2 concepts they get used to. responsible business is not. Then you need to build a core teams to study this. Why you need a core team? Because this is not only concept, this need to be case studies, also learn a lot about international experiences, international guidelines. So some people need to do it first, right? And then you do capacity building for more teachers, right? We are planning to do TOT under this project with UNDP, and we welcome you to join. Problem with COVID-19, we haven't done it yet, right? And then we need to develop materials, right? International cases is nice, but we need local cases. Otherwise, people will say it doesn't apply here, right? Also, guidelines from international convention, international organization is great. But then we need to adapt to local context. At NU, we need to develop a lecture notes or textbook before we can teach in class, right? And then university business relation, because business can help us to have a guest speaker, to have experiential learnings or practical cases, right? So if you want to do the same like us, here are the things that you need to think about. We are still working on it. Next year we will teach it in class, but so we don't know. We're still learning here, right? But what happened? There's one thing that we believe is that we need to bring responsible business idea to classroom at this point. So for this, thank you very much, and I look forward to hear your comment and question.
Professor Tang, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing the wonderful journey that you have gone through over the last period in developing and this new integration on responsible business and human rights together with us and with the support of the Sweden government. Very insightful, the journey that you have gone through intellectually, conceptually, but also in terms of understanding what are the practical aspects that need to be considered. And I'm sure those pieces of advice and information are very useful for the participants today. So with this, we will move now to the Q&A session on the session for this afternoon, which is integrating, adding responsible business and human rights into the business curricula. And before we do that, I would like to have a kind of a quick pulse with the participants before I open the floor. So please hold your question 1 second. We have 5 minutes more. So we want to do a quick pulse on how are you, what are your perceptions and how are you feeling about the subject of this workshop, today's workshop. So I would like to share with you that about 73% of the 45 participants that registered indicated at the beginning of the course that they really wanted to introduce responsible business and human rights into their teaching framework. And 22% said, no, we are not ready yet, we haven't decided. So right now I would like to ask your opinions on where do you stand on this after almost 2 days, after the 2 days of sessions. So if you can raise your thumbs up and tell me if you feel that you are interested or planning to integrate responsible business and human rights into your teaching after what you have learned and your experience. So 1 second just to raise, or with your digital thumb up, please indicate us and give us a signal. We have, let me see. Great, thank you. I guess we still need to do more work to do. We need another workshop to clarify any questions. So let's move on to the Q&A session. I see that there is a question on the chat box. Probably we can take that one first, and then we take the three. There are 3 persons with their hand raised. I will take them in order: Quang, Van, and Lee, if that is okay. And then we go back to Professor Tang and Professor Landau for their answers. So one question in the chat box is, the goal of the UNGPs require businesses from around the world to responsibly respect human rights in the multinational context of their business activities. What is the mechanism for implementing the UNGP's principles in Vietnam and to ensure its effectiveness? Especially, how are the judicial and not judicial compliance set of mechanisms under the UNGPs in Vietnam implemented? So a quick answer from UNDP side is the UNGPs require business to respect human rights both in the national and international context. And in terms of the mechanisms for implementing the UNGP's principles in Vietnam and to ensure its effectiveness, I just want to share very quickly that UNDP, with the support of the Sweden government, we're working with the Ministry of Justice. This year, we started a partnership, and under the leadership of the Ministry of Justice, we will be working in the development of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. So this, the implementation of the UNGPs is still very at the beginning, at the earliest stage in Vietnam. But it's very good that it's starting, and hopefully with the National Action Plan, more clear mechanisms will be in place to ensure that Vietnam is adhering and implementing the UNGPs. At the moment, MOG will set up a working group, a technical working group that will be integrated by at least 16 stakeholders, including government, businesses, state commissions, state-owned enterprises, that will participate in the technical discussions and conversations to develop the National Action Plan. So that's a short answer from my side, but of course, it will be great to hear from Professor Tang and Dr. Landau their opinions on this question as well. But first, before we do that, let me open the floor and give the floor to Quang, who has her hand raised, digital hand raised. Over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, professors. My name is Hương, and I am from the Faculty of International Business, Banking Academy of Vietnam. First, I would like to say thanks to the guest speakers for your great presentation, as well as sharing your valuable experiences in how to teach and integrate responsible business and human rights into business school curricula. It's a good chance for us as the Vietnamese lecturers to learn from the international experience. Well, I can see that the Monash University has been actively integrating responsible business into both specialist and generalist subjects. It's a great idea that the students can have more engagement through a lot of extracurricular activities, and it's really valuable experience that we can learn from. Well, I would like to share some of the challenges in a Vietnamese context regarding the human rights education. First of all, that we lack of the systematic education about human rights. Like in Vietnam, the human rights education in all levels from primary school to university is just theoretical and abstract. And the content of human rights is only integrated into subjects, but it is still mainly considered as a topic within the scope of subjects like international laws, and thus leading to the lack of close connection between the subjects and human rights education content. In addition, the subjects of human rights has only been taught at some universities or colleges specializing in law or social studies, but not in all fields of study at university or colleges. And the second one, I totally agree with Dr. Ingrid Landau, is that there is a limited awareness and understanding of the students about human rights. And sometimes in Vietnam, human rights is a kind of sensitive word to mention. The third challenge is that the lecturers in Vietnam are not trained well in order to teach this human rights content. So I just want to ask Dr. Ingrid Landau, do you have any advice or sharings about how we can deal with these challenges in Vietnam? Thank you.
Sorry, Diana, do you want me to answer that now? Yes.
Yeah, sorry, my mic was muted. So do you mind if we take another question and then I hand over to you for this first round of questions and answers? So Van, you want to come in as the next with the next question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so good afternoon. I'm Van from National Economic University, and it is my pleasure today to attend such a meaningful and helpful workshop about responsible business and human rights with many great experience from international experts. I have one question for Professor Lando and one for Professor Tang. For Professor Lando, as you just shared, your university has integrated responsible business in various courses and modules, which is really great. But can you refer back to the initial phase when you just started the journey and share your experience about what were the difficulties that you and your university have overcome to integrate the R&B in the curriculum? Because I believe that it could be a great suggestion for our university at this phase. My question for Professor Tang is that, as you and Professor David just said, responsible business is a wider concept compared to human rights. So why do you choose to integrate R&B in the curriculum as the overall concept instead of focusing on human rights first, instead of integrating human rights in the curriculum first? That were my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Van. Very good question. So should we go back to Dr. Landau and then Professor Tang for the answers? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. To Hung on the how to approach, I think the other question was going to how to approach teaching human rights in Vietnam. I completely understand, I think, the challenges, and I think a lot of my students that come from, particularly from the region, do find it difficult. I think Professor Tang talked about integrating human rights into responsible business. I think it's a great approach. And like you mentioned, it's the OECD's approach. And there's really not much difference because, as Professor Tang mentioned, that the emphasis is still really importantly on not having adverse impacts on people or on the environment. And that's what it's all about. My original background is not human rights, it's labor rights. And I think, so for me, I still see human rights instrumentally. So, how can we use human rights tools and human rights things to basically to improve things. So I'm not particularly, I'm not so concerned about how we talk about it. I also think it's really important to remember that human rights in a national context, human rights are integrated, kind of embedded in national laws in a huge variety of ways. For example, in Vietnam or in anywhere, that employment law, for example, rights, non-discrimination, rights to all those kind of rights are human rights, but they are, if you're talking about how to kind of implement them or respect them, you can see them kind of, they're kind of on the ground, they're implemented in lots of different ways. So sometimes it's focusing on those issues. So for, a number of my students, I think in some countries they will focus on, working conditions and labor rights, and often they will write their paper, which is on kind of their business and human rights paper on those issues. And to me, that's absolutely fine because it is still within that field, but they are kind of finding a way that they are more comfortable researching and writing it. I hope that makes sense. The other question goes to the initial phase of integrating business and human rights and responsible business conduct at Monash. I'm not sure, maybe this is just us, but one of the challenges is knowing what we actually already do. which sounds ridiculous, but when you've got, you know, 7 departments and 20,000 students, like I know some of your institutions do too, understanding what teachers actually, what lecturers are already teaching in this area can be difficult. So for us, you know, and I mentioned kind of, we had in 2018, basically a mapping exercise where we tried to collect information from all the different lecturers and departments on what do you teach that is already fits within these concepts and this approach. And for us, that was really useful because once you have that kind of information, which can be hard to get, but then you can see where the gaps are, you know, what is covered well and what is not. And so on. One of the other challenges that I really faced, and I don't know if anyone's had the same experience, but the reality is that different departments do, you know, teach this differently. And CSR is still taught at a, you know, business school in Department of Management or business ethics. And the realities are that, you know, these lecturers who teach those may be sensitive about having a new concept, which they think is somehow in competition with theirs. So I think that is a really kind of important thing to keep in mind, that, you know, when you're trying to, you know, you want to kind of have a, you know, what we call in English a broad church, you know, you want everyone, you know, to bring people in to support. And if that means running, you know, having different approaches to the same goal and ends, then I think that is absolutely fine. And for us, you know, the reality is we are not, you know, and I don't know if we ever will be, but we're not at the stage like, you know, Doro mentioned, my dream would be from a business school to support having a human rights thread or lens in everything. But the reality is, you know, I'm not going to get that. But, you know, we can get this, you know, broad support and awareness around responsible business and, you know, hopefully move it towards the human rights perspective. And I think it's, you know, and as a start, just having that business and human rights presence is, I think, is important. And that's, I guess, where we're at.
Thank you, Dr. Landau. Professor Tang, you want to comment?
Yes. The question is, why don't we just focus on human rights? But we focus broader. We take a broader focus on the cost. There are 2 reasons at this point. First, if you attend a conference on corruption, you see corruption is #1 concern in Vietnam. If you attend a conference on environment pollution is emerging and maybe #1 concern in Vietnam now, right? So there's many issues that relate pressing in Vietnam. So the need for business to help addressing this issue at the same time is great. That's why we want to create a cost that cover a little bit broader than just human rights to address the need of the countries, right? So the cost can say responsible business, not only human rights, but also respecting, protecting the environment and respecting the integrity values of business. The second reason that you already talk about is a little bit of organizational politics, right? Responsible business is easier to convince anyone who first hear about it than human rights causes, right, in Vietnam. So let's talk about let's focus on the role, like Professor Landau said, focus on the role with this thing. But the terminology, if we avoid arguing on the terminology, that's a good thing.
Thank you, Professor Tang. Very, very practical and advice and approaches to start integrating and pushing forward this movement here in Vietnam. I think that's a good way to go. So we have three participants with their hands raised. So we'll take them, the 3 of them. So if you could introduce yourself, your name and the organization or university you come from, that would be great. So Lee, then Bjorn, and then Chan, in that order.
Yes.
Lee?
So, yes, thank you, Chair. First of all, I would like to say thank you all for all the presentation. I learned a great deal one of them, and from the discussion as well. So I am Tammy. Lee is my family name, and at the moment I'm a PhD candidate in ESCP Business School in France. And so within my my PhD experience, I have some teaching activity as well. And so one of the courses that I have been teaching is called The Dark Side of Sustainability. So the dark side of sustainability, where we're trying to show the student the bad practices, where many companies trying to fake their activities regarding responsible business practices. And so with the conversations we have today, it's really helped me to deal with a lot of my wonderings. First of all, how we can, adapt the teaching of business and human rights into a local context like Vietnam, where we have very different categories or different audience in our classroom. The business they are running or they're going to run is slightly different from corporations, right? They might be SME, they can be just company, but not corporations. And so I think that from the presentation of Professor Tang, I have learned a great deal on how we can translate the viewpoint of corporate viewpoint into business viewpoint in integrating business and human rights into teaching in business school in Vietnam. My question in here is that from my field work in Vietnam, I realized that many business has exposed to the requirement of the brands to comply to their COC, a code of conduct, and we containing a lot of human rights requirement in that. But we see there's a lot of violation, which is not appear in any kind of reports, official report of the brands or maybe of that company is. For example, non-payment or no employment contract. Sometimes we have child labor inside the factory. So it's at the different levels of the business. It's in the suppliers. They are not corporations, but there's a violation there in business and human rights. And how in our way in teaching this subject in business school in Vietnam, we can try to promote more real implementation of real compliance in that area of rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Cha. Bjorn, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all speakers for educating us on this extremely interesting and important subject. My name is Björn Nyström from Uppsala University, Sweden, where I am active at the Unit for Global Partnerships. Now, our background is that we work to provide our researchers and international partners with external funding to carry out joint development and innovation projects. And Professor Tang, when I saw your presentation, you mentioned a few challenges that you have identified in the development of this field. So I'm very curious to know, in the new Erasmus Plus and the EU funding program period that we are entering, I know that you have a lot of experience in international joint development and innovation projects. So I would be interested to hearing your expert view on where do you see the role of this type of external funding and joint development and innovation when it comes to universities in Vietnam developing responsible business education. That would be very valuable for us to hear in order to better support our own researchers and partners in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then Chan, the mic is yours. You can unmute. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So I have to say that I I'm very interested in these topics, responsible business and human rights. And then basically a lot of things that we have covered so far in the 2-day seminars. And just now when I heard Dr. Thang's presentation, I have to really agree with him, a point where he talked about responsible business should not be looked at as an add-on to business. Instead, it should be considered an approach to business or a way of doing business. And so I do think that, in order for students, right now I felt like students, at least the students I teach, I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Jung, and I'm a marketing teacher from the National Economics University. So at least from my students' point of view, I do get a sense that they are still feeling responsible business or business ethics or something that are, out of reach, something that are, nice, but not practical. So I see that we have proposed solution. We have proposed, integrating all these topics into maybe a class like a business ethics or agricultural business as a plan Dr. Thang has proposed. But I want to add to that. Because a lot of the programs that I teach here at NEU, we are taught in English, and we use international textbook from like the UK, from the US. And every chapter, they have an ethics, ethics part on the very end of the chapter. And the way we Vietnamese build the syllabus, we tend to ignore that part. We don't somehow we don't talk about ethics. We only focus on, the materials, instead of the ethical concerns. So the thing that we can do now and easily do, I think, is that for all teachers to start to put more weight on the ethical parts of their lecture, of every session, of every chapter that they teach, to get the students familiarize themselves with the subject, with being ethical, being responsible in anything that they do, not just in business. So that is I think we can start from there, and then it will be very nice, as Dr. Thang has proposed, to add a course or to design activities and everything, so that the students will feel will receive a wholesome education and information on this particular topic. So that will help change their mind a little bit, I guess. I hope. So yeah, that's my comment. I have a question.
Thank you, Chan, for your reflection. So with this, we turn back to our speakers, Dr. Landau and then Professor Chan, for your response. Over to you. Dr. Landau, you want to go first?
I think those 3 questions were general, as I understand them, directed at Professor Thang, and I'm really interested in hearing his responses. So okay. I'm going to defer to him if that's all right.
Okay, Professor Chan.
Okay, there are several questions that directly address to me. Chami's question is the hard one that we are thinking about it, right? When the firms have everything on their wall and on their website, code of conduct, rules, standards, but they still violate. How can we improve that situation? Now that's the very hard question. And I think that's why we are doing this, because we want to influence the future generation of leaders, where the external measure, like a code of conduct, the values, are internalized by managers, that they will truly believe it, truly take responsibilities in their working days. If we only use external measures, then when we turn back, they will do their traditional way, like we see so far. So the concept are nice, values are nice, but then we need to combine both monitoring the system and then help them to internalize this into their personal beliefs. I don't know how we can do it, but that's the way we have to do it. And maybe we start with undergraduates, and maybe earlier than that. So that's my take on Chami's question. On Bijon's question on the role of external fundings on this kind of initiative, at least I see 3 very important roles that external fundings can help us here to develop a new programs or new course like this. External fundings, the first one is to help us to convince people that convince people that this is a legitimate venture, right? This is not something that we dream of yesterday and now we propose that we do. But this is a legitimate venture because international experts are working on that. International donors are supporting this. It must be important to do. So that's role number one. Number two is to have also technical support, right? Of course, we are the followers. We need to learn a lot of experiences and the way that you guys already did 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So technical support is great. And capacity buildings, right? So these are three, at least for this point, three very important roles that external fundings can help us, if any, right? The funding from Swedish government and UNDP with us here plays that role, right? Of course, we would be happy to have more for the teaching, for capacity building, but these things I see on external fundings, right? I guess that's a question for me. I think in the chat box have there's one question. Maybe Ingrid is more entitled to answer. When you teach human rights, do students feel that we are imposing our values on them? Right? I haven't taught that yet. Next year, but you already taught several years. So,
Dr. Landau, do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I was really surprised when I started teaching human rights at a business school. My background, as I said, is law, and law students have been learning about human rights, for a long time. And when I first taught this unit at business school, I thought I would get a lot of business students being dismissive or students, I guess, not convinced. And I find it's often the other way. The students are kind of really idealistic. And often, I'm the one that's been the cynic in the room. So I'm really pleasantly surprised. I do think that comes with kind of pros and cons, is that, I find that because the students, even, it's postgraduate level, they are really enthusiastic, that I do have to kind of, in some ways, kind of remind them that they will be working in businesses where those above them might not feel the same way. So a lot of the work that I try and do is to get them to imagine they're in kind of working in companies, or to talk and kind of how do they make the case to those, that make the case to their bosses, or that this is important, because I can't just, say, I learned about this and I think it's really important. They need to, for me, that's where the kind of the business case can be useful. They need to convince, be able to convince others, being, what we call an intrapreneur, to be able to convince others within the businesses that they're operating or working within that this is important. So we spend quite a lot of time on that. So to answer the question, I don't find that is a challenge at all.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Landau, and thank you, Professor Chang. I think with this, we have come to an end. I just wanted to add my own personal reflection on the questions and how we can make sure that companies and business indeed apply and enforce the corporate policies, the codes of conduct. I mean, it goes beyond just universities integrating this into this subject into their curriculum. I mean, it requires a systematic transformation that goes from the entire education system, from elementary and primary school to secondary and higher level education. So by the time they come to university, those principles and those kind of behaviors are already integrated and embedded into the students and citizens. But there are also other drivers and factors that can push forward this movement of responsible business practice and bring them along. It's transparency, radical transparency, making sure that citizens and governments demand full transparency and proper reporting of their practices of the businesses, and citizens and government are monitoring the operations and the practices that business are implementing and enforcing in their own country and abroad. So it is of course here we're talking to universities and potential future leaders, and it will be a long-term change. But there are a lot of moving pieces as part of this ecosystem that are required to make this change happen a little bit faster. So yeah, and that's what UNDP is working on, along with businesses, governments, civil society, academia, to make sure that we start bringing together the entire ecosystem along our side and pushing forward for this transformation in Vietnam. And we have really high hopes because we know that this change is happening in other parts of the world. And we know that citizens in Vietnam, their awareness and their commitment to sustainable development is very high. So we know that this change will be happening, and the demands from business are coming from the ground as well, from the citizens' voices as well. So we are coming to the end of the workshop for today. And before we do that and we move to the closing remarks, if I would kindly ask you if you can turn on your cameras so we can take a group picture. And also, if you could please help us disseminate the messages on responsible business practice. You will see in the chat box the hashtag that we are promoting, the response Vietnam. It will be in the chat box right now. So please do this, help us disseminate the voice, amplify the voices and the message into your social media platforms. That will be very helpful. That's the way we all can contribute to make this movement work. Please do turn on your camera so we can take a picture. Thank you. Coming along. We have 2 pages. We have 69 participants, so it will take thank you. Thank you so much. So with this, we'll come to the closing session. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Bui Nong, who is the Vice President of the National Economic University and who will give us the closing remarks from NEU. Over to you, Professor Nong.
Okay, thank you. Dear Ms. Hanoi, Ambassador of Students in Vietnam. Dear Ms. Diana Torres, Head of Governance and Participations of UNDP Vietnam. Ladies and gentlemen, after 3 hours of open and constructive discussions, I believe that we have reached our goals set out for the seminar. For all, I would like to thank all presenters today. I think that not only me, but also our colleagues from NEU very happy to learn a lot of insights from presenters, especially from international presenters, and the comments, discussions from the seminar. We agree that teaching responsible business requires hard work, and NEU, we have spent a lot of time for this topic. But I strongly believe that it is necessary and imperative for us at this time. In coming years, NEU continues and will take responsible business in the following most areas. The first, we are developing 2 courses. The first one, it is responsible management, and the second course, ethics and responsibility in agricultural businesses. Both courses cover responsible business practice, including human rights. These courses will be offered for undergraduate students. We will share the material from these projects to our teacher and encourage them to integrate to include relevant contents in their existing courses. From my observations, I think that many courses could do so. The third, we will introduce the modules on responsible business to our executive MBA program. Broadly, I believe that higher education need to create a new generation of business leaders who respect to the rights of related stakeholders and contributes to sustainable development of society. We are, as the National Economic University, is pioneering this idea, these missions. We will be happy to share our experience to our peers. Finally, on behalf of National Economic University, I would like to thank the Swedish government for generous support to the project. I also want to thank UNDP in Vietnam for valuable and effective cooperation in the project. Thank you all for your interest and support in this venture. I wish you happiness and success. Once again, thank you so much. And we looking forward to meeting you in NEU. Thank you and bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It takes a while to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Professor No. So before I lose you all, I know you're tired and ready to go. Allow me to deliver the closing remarks on behalf of UNDP. I want to express on behalf of UNDP the appreciation for the National Economic University and the government of Sweden for the respectively co-hosting and supporting today's seminar and yesterday's seminar on advancing responsible business education in business and economic schools in Vietnam. And to all the distinguished participants, professors, speakers that came from different parts of society and the world to join us during this two-day seminar. It has been a wonderful and very enriching experience. I see that, and I hope that the last 2 days have provoked you and in your great interest on the academia in teaching and expanding responsible business with a human rights lens. We hope that business insights, as well as the international experience and hand-on experiences that have been shared in teaching business and human rights at business schools and economics schools will motivate our academic staff to integrate human rights lenses into their business courses. Allow me to take this opportunity to once again emphasize the responsible business practices mean that businesses taking accountability over their operations to ensure no harm is done to human rights, or the rights and legitimate benefits of relevant stakeholders in their supply chain, from customers to employees and from suppliers to local community. To achieve this goal, businesses must proactively assess their social and environmental impacts by conducting human rights and environmental due diligence. Then they should take measures to prevent negative impacts and provide access to remedy if the negative impacts occur. This includes going beyond just compliance with the national laws, and where necessary, aligning with international laws and standards, including the International Labor Standards, the International Environmental Law, and the International Human Rights Laws. I really hope that this seminar already offers new insights and practical approaches to the academic staff in Vietnam. We hope it's raising awareness and will strengthen better capacities in teaching responsible business with human rights lenses. Our hope is that after this workshop, academic staff will have a growing interest in introducing responsible business and human rights into their teaching syllabus and will help prepare Vietnam future professionals and business leaders in the field. We really look forward to having you and joining us in this journey that we are walking on responsible business and creating a bigger movement in Vietnam. UNDP will continue with the support of the government of Sweden, remains committed to responsible business and human rights agenda in Vietnam, which is a crucial at the core of the Sustainable Development Agenda. Thank you so much, distinguished professors, speakers, for your time and insights. Thank you so much for the NAU team and for Professor Tang for your excellent co-chairing throughout the two days event. And lastly, thank you so much for all the participants that remain interested and engaged in the last 2 days. And thank you for your questions, your curiosity, and we hope to see you soon again in our next journey. Thank you so much. Xin cảm ơn.
Thank you, Diana. Xin cảm
Thank
ơn.
you. Thank you, Professor Orlando. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lando.
Thank you very
Professor
much.
Thắng. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Sandra. Thank you.
Bye, Sandra.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Cảm ơn các thầy cô trường Kinh tế Quốc dân đã tổ chức hai cái buổi tọa đàm rất thú vị ạ. Cảm ơn các thầy các cô.
Cảm ơn thầy Phong, cảm ơn các thầy cô đã dự.
Cảm ơn các thầy các
cô ạ.
Cảm ơn cô Ngọc Anh.
Dạ, cảm ơn thầy Thắng và các thầy cô ạ.
Em cảm ơn các thầy cô ạ.
Cảm ơn các thầy cô ạ.
Cảm ơn em. Cảm ơn Hằng, lâu lắm mới lại nhìn thấy.
Dạ, đây, em đang định đăng ký học với thầy môn writing ạ.
Học writing á.
Thầy khỏe không ạ?
Sang năm học cũng được mà. Sang năm học cũng được mà. Dỗi chưa?
Dạ.
Dỗi chưa?
Cũng chưa hẳn ạ, nhưng mà em muốn học cái writing course trước thì có được không ạ?
Được. Học trước rồi lại học sau, học tiếp nữa mà.
Vâng ạ. Môn thầy Bạch Thắng với môn thầy Cảnh thì xin phép để năm sau cũng được ạ.
Không vấn đề gì.
Vâng, vâng ạ. Em cảm ơn các thầy ạ. Cảm ơn thầy Bạch Thắng và cảm ơn giáo sư. Cảm ơn các thầy cô. Vâng.
Chào chị, xin chào mọi người. Dạ.